Have you ever felt darkness seeping into every cell of your body as invisible hands grip your throat, making your heart pound in agony? Get ready, because you're about to confront entities without boundaries. Shadows come to life, whispers turn into sinister threats, and fear becomes your constant companion. Forget about sleep and peace. We're opening the doors to a world where night not only hides, but hunts your deepest fears. Turn up the volume, get comfortable, and prepare to be shaken to your core.
This road had long been sparsely traveled. It seemed abandoned, as if it had vanished from all GPS maps, and only locals remembered it in their eerie legends. A remote place known as Shadow Road, it was infamous for its dark history and frequent disappearances. Darkness enveloped everything, and only the thin line of headlights pierced through the dense fog. It was an ordinary night for Andrew, who was heading home after a grueling workday. He knew this road like the back of his hand, so he didn't expect anything suspicious. The wind swayed the old trees along the road, giving the impression that the branches were reaching for the car. The creepy music he had accidentally found on the radio only added to the overall mood. His car purred quietly, as if trying not to draw any undue attention. The wind whistling through the cracks in the windows seemed like the road's voice trying to warn him of danger. Never before had the road seemed so long and empty. A strange premonition gripped the driver, growing stronger with each passing mile. He saw it from a distance, a shadow standing by the roadside, extending a thumb. Andrew hesitated for only a moment. You don't see people like him anymore, he thought. Who hitchhikes on a road in the middle of the night? But the weather was dreadful, and leaving someone out there would be downright cruel. He stopped the car and opened the door for the stranger. The hitchhiker was dressed in an old-fashioned coat and hat, making him look like someone from another era. His face was partially hidden in the shadows, so it was impossible to see him clearly.
"Thank you for the ride,"
said the passenger as he settled into the front seat. His voice was soft yet piercing, like a whisper that left an unsettling feeling deep inside. Andrew nodded, trying to ignore the strange sensation that had enveloped him right after meeting the hitchhiker. They drove in silence, only the sound of the engine breaking the quiet. Occasionally, Andrew glanced at his passenger, but he remained still, staring straight ahead. His face remained hidden in the shadows, but Andrew couldn't shake the feeling that the stranger's eyes were watching his every move. Suddenly, the radio began to crackle, and instead of music, unintelligible whispers filled the air. Andrew tried to change the station, but it was no use. The whispers only grew louder, forming a horrifying chorus of voices. He stopped the car, intending to turn off the radio, when he suddenly noticed that his passenger had vanished. The doors didn't open, and there was no sound. The passenger had simply evaporated, as if he had never been there. Panicking, Andrew began to look around, but there was no sign of any soul. He was alone in the middle of a desolate forest. Was that just my imagination? He tried to reassure himself, but the sense of fear only grew stronger. Suddenly, the rear doors of the car flew open with a crash. Andrew spun around and saw his passenger sitting there, calmly smiling.
"Did you lose something?"
the hitchhiker asked quietly, as if nothing had happened. His eyes gleamed red, like those of a predatory beast. Andrew felt a cold sweat run down his back. He tried to ask how the hitchhiker had ended up in the back seat, but the words stuck in his throat. Feeling that he was losing control, Andrew decided to drive as fast as he could to the nearest city and throw the passenger out of the car. He pressed the accelerator and sped madly, ignoring the road. But the road seemed endless. It stretched out, as if turning into an infinite tunnel of darkness. The headlights could not pierce the thick gloom, and only the voices he had heard on the radio accompanied him.
"You can't escape,"
whispered the voice of the passenger from the back seat.
"This road is not for those who want to live."
Suddenly, he felt something grabbing him by the neck from behind. Barely stifling a scream, Andrew managed to turn his head and saw the hitchhiker's face. It was disfigured, covered in scars, and the eyes glowed with emptiness. But this was not just human fear. It was something far worse. It was the face of death. Andrew felt something cold and damp rising up his spine, as if the darkness itself was trying to engulf him. He barely managed to keep from losing consciousness. There were only a few kilometers left to the nearest city when Andrew finally saw the first lights. He tried to turn and tell the passenger to get out, but instead found the back seat empty again. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his hands turned white. The car doors were locked, but Andrew heard heavy breathing behind him, as if an invisible presence was sitting right behind his shoulder. Finally, he reached the city and screeched to a halt by the first streetlight. He looked out of the car, trying to breathe and calm himself. But then, like a thunderclap, he heard a creaking sound, as if someone had opened the door. Andrew turned around and saw that the passenger was once again in the back seat, but this time his face was blurred, as if his image were reflected in a fogged-up mirror. He seemed to be both here and in another dimension.
Are we there?
Asked the hitchhiker with a creepy smile. But his voice was no longer a quiet whisper. It sounded ominous and dreadful, like thunder in the night sky. Andrew threw open the door and jumped out of the car, leaving the keys in the ignition. He ran to the nearest house, not looking back until he heard a distant car alarm. Looking back, he saw his car moving backward, as if guided by invisible hands. Suddenly, the car stopped, and the lights went out. Silence reigned around, but it was not a peaceful silence. It was a silence that was unsettling, as if waiting for something inevitable. Returning to the car, Andrew found it empty again. But on the back seat, he discovered an old, tattered book. It looked as if it had been buried underground for decades. Opening it, he saw entries written in long faded ink. Hitchhiker, missing since 1964, last seen on this road. Andrew was horrified and dropped the book on the floor. It became clear to him that his passenger had been dead for many years, and everything he had felt when the passenger appeared again was more real than any nightmare. He could no longer drive alone at night. Every time he got behind the wheel, he was overcome by the same fear he felt when he first saw the shadow by the roadside. He was haunted by the image of that face, disfigured, distorted, as if it had been pulled from another world. Every sound on the road filled him with panic. Every flash of light seemed to threaten that the creature would return to take him into the darkness. Andrew became paranoid. He began to hear whispers even when the radio was off. They echoed in his head, amplifying his fear and anxiety. From that moment, he began to notice strange things. At night, footsteps were heard in his house, as if an invisible presence roamed through his rooms. Sometimes he would wake up to find the very old book he had found in the car on his bedside table. He would destroy it, burn it, tear it apart, but it would reappear in the same place. From time to time, he would see the hitchhiker's face in the mirrors, not directly, but as a shadow in the background that vanished when he turned. That face followed him everywhere. He could not pass a mirror without seeing that disfigured smile. Fear became his constant companion. Andrew began to lose friends, distancing himself from his family. He shut himself in, never going outside, afraid to step into the street. Every sound, every movement made him flinch. He became a shadow of himself, wandering through his house as if it were his prison. Finally, he decided to leave the city. He packed his belongings and moved to another state, trying to escape his past. But even in a new place, he found no peace. Wherever he went, the shadow of the hitchhiker followed him. One evening, he once again heard the familiar sound of footsteps in his house. He got out of bed, looked around, but saw no one. His heart pounded in his chest as he felt a cold wind cutting through the room. The feeling that someone was standing beside him was so real that he could not suppress his scream. The lights suddenly went out, and the room plunged into absolute darkness. He heard heavy breathing behind him. When he turned around, he saw the hitchhiker's face very close to his own.
"We're here,"
whispered the hitchhiker, and his voice sounded like thunder in the silence. Andrew fell to the floor, trying to run, but the doors were locked, and he couldn't find an escape. Darkness began to envelop him from all sides, and he felt the hitchhiker's hands grabbing his shoulders. He screamed, but no one heard him. Darkness became his world. When his neighbors found him the next morning, the doors were locked from the inside, and Andrew lay dead on the floor. His face was twisted in terror, and his hands tightly clutched the very old book. No one could explain what had happened, but everyone knew one thing. This book was cursed, and anyone who read it could not escape their terrible fate. Since then, rumors began to spread in the town. People spoke of the hitchhiker's ghost wandering the roads in search of new victims. Those who saw him never returned home. Only the old-timers knew that this road was cursed and that the shadows on its edges were not merely an illusion. So remember this story, dear reader, when you're driving alone on a deserted road. If you see a shadow standing by the roadside, think carefully before you stop, for some roads never end, and some passengers never leave.